Hi everyone and welcome to Back in Time Fiction, my little channel dedicated to historical fiction and historical fantasy. If you've watched any of my previous videos, there is a 50% chance that you've heard me speaking of genius writer Robert Law. My very first video was a review of his saga The Oath Sworn, and he was also in my top 3 historical fiction writers video. It was actually my hope to one day interview him and maybe even meet the man behind some of my favorite novels. Sadly, it will never happen because Robert Law passed away a few weeks ago at the end of the month of May. I wasn't sure if I should do a video about him. I really don't want to offend his family and friends, but at the same time I really want you guys to know more about Robert Law and maybe discover some of his books. So, as most of his characters would, I thought, you know what, fuck it, let's do it and think about it later. So, Robert Law. We'll talk about his books in a minute, but first let's talk about the man. Like many great writers, Robert Law started in journalism, but unlike many others, he was a war journalist and started his career in Vietnam. Then his future battlefields would be in Eastern Europe. It should be pointed out that Robert Law is from Scotland, which explains a lot of the character he seemed to have been. He was, for example, an active member of medieval battle reenactment. Actually, in most of the pictures I could find of him, you can see him wearing some ancient clothes or maybe carrying a sword or a round shield. His passion for ancient warfare transpires in every line of his writing, and if you too like this kind of topics, you should definitely read his novels. Robert Law wrote 4 series of novels, and each of them is a masterpiece. The first of them, about which I talked in my very first video, is centered around the Oath Sworn, a group of Vikings struggling through the later years of the Viking Age. The first 4 of those novels are centered around the main group, led by Orm, a young man with just a bit more senses than his men. The 5th book of the saga is more of a spin-off, but by no means is inferior to the others. You can watch my video on the topic for more details, but The Oath Sworn remains to me one of the best Viking stories ever written, and if you like the genre, do yourself a favor and read them. Then there was the Kingdom trilogy. Those 3 novels describe the struggle of the First War of Scottish independence, mostly through the actions of the fictional character Hal of Herdmanston. And if you don't really know about this time period, think Braveheart, but much better. I will say this though, Robert Law knew his stuff, maybe a little bit too well, and if you want to read this novel, it really doesn't hurt to know a bit more about the topic beforehand. The first chapter of The Lion Awakes, which is the first novel in the trilogy, is to these days the most difficult chapter I've ever read. There is a lot of head jumping, a lot of very specific vocabulary, and the action is going on and you have to remember all those information at the same time. And yet, there is no way to stop. Law's talents with word turn this chapter in some kind of scene from a Hollywood movie, and it leaves you completely breathless. Then it gets easier to read. I had a very similar feeling with the very first chapter of The Oath Sworn, so in both cases make sure to read further than the first chapter. Robert Law went further back in time with his 3rd series, Brothers of the Sand. This series is set toward the end of the Roman glorious time, and if you are tired of the genre, especially considering the amazing quantity of novels set in that period of time, do read Brothers of the Sand. It is a unique story in the genre. In this trilogy, we follow the few ups and many lows of a group of former gladiators who now work for pretty much anyone with the coins to hire them. While most of their usual missions consist in capturing beasts for the games from any corner of the empire, they do have a knack for bad luck and end up hired for missions with great impacts for Rome. I absolutely adore this band of rugged characters. Each of them brings so much to the dynamic of the group. And while usually I am not a big fan of flashbacks, Robert Law used them with brio and I couldn't get enough of them. He put a ton of research on that story, but it never shows too much. Some novels can feel like history manuals, while some treat history with too little care. Robert Law found the perfect balance with Brothers of the Sand. We are far from stories like those on Spartacus where gladiators' lives are used cheaply. Law's Rome feels much more real. Even the main character, Drust, he is very far from what we came to expect of a Roman character. While he is the leader of this small group, in many regards he is the weakest of the group when it comes to fighting skills. and this was super refreshing. If Justice may be my favorite among all Robert Low's characters, the one I feel he wrote with the greatest care was Batty Coldhouse, from the last of his trilogy, The Border Rivers. This time we go back to Scotland in mid-16th century, right at the border between Scotland and England. In the first volume, we follow 15-year-old Minty Henderson as she seeks revenge for the murder of her father, helped by Batty Coldhouse, a one-armed mercenary of a kind, rough and quick-witted as any of Robert Low's character. Even though The Border Rivers was not my favorite among all Robert Low's stories, there was something absolutely amazing in the writing. As I mentioned before, Robert Low's writing is my favorite of all. But he took it a step further in this story, especially in the movements of the character. Every time the characters move, it feels very smooth and fluid. You can really see it. Now again, it's better to start this story if you know a bit about Scotland's history first. And here you go, 4 chances for you to discover or rediscover great historical fiction. My deepest condolences to Robert Low's families and friends. Please know that his novels are adored throughout the world, and even here in Japan I have a bunch of his novels in my bookshelf. I even bought one of his books in Chengdu in China, and that says a lot. Please let me know in the comments of this video what you thought of Robert Low's novel, and if you've met the man, please share your stories there as well. I will be back very soon with more content on the very best genre of literature. Until then, remember to subscribe to this channel, grab a book or two and enjoy. See ya!